Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Last month we looked at the best civilizations for low elo players specifically, which we defined as 850 elo and under. Going by the latter win rate stats, it revealed some interesting patterns, with a surprising amount of infantry and blacksmith themed bonuses showing up. Of course, that left the job only half done. So now let's look at the other extreme of the worst performing civilizations at low elo to see what it tells us about these sorts of bonuses and civilization designs that underperform for newer players. Now, there's always a discussion on this sort of topic about whether civ choice matters at low elo because of so many inefficiencies going on, and I'm not going to rehash that argument here. The fact is, civilization choice does impact the game at all levels, and I think the more fruitful discussion is looking at why particular civs do or don't work, with a completely different list here than for the competitive scene to emphasize that point. One caveat to keep in mind for all this is by their nature, lower performing civilizations tend to also be unpopular. Plus, by definition, we're looking at already just about a quarter of the online player base who also happen to play the least number of games on average. So for that reason, we have relatively smaller sample sizes, and the players who get these while going random civ tend to have less experience with them. To the point, I wouldn't argue strongly for any exact ordering here. Also, if you personally are in this elo bracket and find your favorite civilization lands on the list, that doesn't mean you shouldn't play it. If anything, you should be proud for giving yourself an extra challenge. With that, we'll start off with what's technically the 10th worst civ in the stats as of our snapshot in time, with the Georgians. For context, we're talking about just under a 48% win rate here, so nothing dramatic. But if you were expecting Georgians to be higher up, you really haven't been paying attention for a while, as they've been creeping a bit lower almost every patch, taking an extra big hit last April when their HP regeneration bonus was nerfed and the swordsman line received its overhaul. For 1000 plus and 1200 plus elo, they're actually the worst performing civ at the moment across all maps, so if anything are slightly overperforming at lower levels. They're then among the least popular civilizations at 850 and under, and we see a clear pattern that they're increasingly favored at higher elo, maybe partly because those players tend to also own the DLCs more often. The main story here is they're just tanking in the mid-game, especially on Arabia, but also just on all maps more generally. Their main early eco bonus with the mule cart is maybe a little hard to know how to use to its full potential, but then fortified churches can be a bit tricky to navigate since they compete for wood with town centers and farms in the mid-game. That's true at high levels as well, but it's just the kind of thing that's extra hard to optimize for less experienced players. That said, they do just fine in the late game when their Manaspa can start to shine. So often, when a civilization has a low win rate, there's an assumption that we should talk about buffing them, but in this case, I disagree. The profile of the civ is just a slow start and a strong late game, which happens to not really lend itself to a good win rate for high or low elo 1v1 play. Next up, in number 9, we have another cavalry civilization, with the Burgundians. Very similar to Georgians, this is a situation with a bit slower start, and then some tricky to navigate bonuses and trade-offs in the mid-game. The civ is actually performing its worst at this skill level, and I suspect a lot of that comes down to the difficulty using their 1 age earlier economic upgrades. In addition to players at this level probably not getting eco upgrades as often as they should to begin with, I also think the bonus can be a false friend, as early access to techs like wheelbarrow and crop rotation doesn't necessarily mean it's a good time to get them, and can actually leave you behind in resources or with not enough military. Let's face it, cavalry civs are also struggling a lot right now with the increasing role of infantry and the large number of camel civs in the game at this point. If those factors can make the once legendary Franks suffer, it's just going to hit a slower and similar one-dimensional cavalry civ like Burgundians even harder. Again, I don't think anything has to change about the civilization necessarily. They're just a late-game focused civ, and cavalry isn't as dominant these days as it was. Moving on, at number 8, we have the Koreans. They give us a great contrast to the previous two, as more of an archer-focused civilization that also has a strong early game, which apparently falls off into nothing. A notable pattern that jumps out immediately is how much they seem to improve with skill level, which is actually a consistent trend we see across the archer specialist civilizations, several of which will appear in this list. Koreans are interesting because they get free armor upgrades and unit discounts, which seem like they should be excellent bonuses at lower levels, as passive bonuses, especially giving you blacksmith techs for free, just intuitively feels like it should be helping out, but in this case doesn't bring the civ out of the C tier. The simplest explanation is archers are micro-intensive to use, and with lower APM and attention bandwidth at this level, that's just an extra challenge. If you have limited actions to work with, and you're using micro but your opponent isn't, you have to wonder what's being neglected at the archer player's base that an infantry or cavalry player can attend to. And I would love to see stats about the villager idle time in the mid-game based on civilization. I suspect archer civs would have more than others because of that emphasis on micro. Another interesting story told in the stats is their profile over game length is almost the opposite of high-level play, where Koreans are weaker early but a very strong mid to late game civ, and maybe speaks to different uses of the Korean tech tree, unique unit, or how the tempo of archer civs plays at different levels. Either way, next up at number 7, we have the Berbers as another cavalry civilization. I find they're a surprisingly unpopular civ at this level. On the one hand, they lack a strong early eco bonus, but going into Castle Age have a very nice passive discount on cavalry. You would think early eco bonuses matter less at low elo, so missing one wouldn't be too much of a hindrance. And Berbers are also pretty straightforward to play, while actually having a pretty versatile and powerful unique unit in the Camel Archer. So in a way, it's a little surprising they're on a bottom 10 list. The main thing I take away from that is cavalry civs just aren't great at this level currently. Though funny enough, as you get closer to 1000 elo, Berbers actually start to do alright, and closer to what we'd expect. It's just the lowest elo bracket that's getting hit a little harder, possibly because of their predictable nature and the fact that infantry is what really dominates these days, especially against cavalry civs. That's actually our last cavalry civ for the moment though, and now we reach 2 of the pure archer civs back to back. First at number 6 with the Mayans, or Maya as they were renamed a few months back. There was a long period before Definitive Edition where Mayans were considered possibly the best civ in the game, and a look at their win rate in different elo brackets shows us how much an archer civ appears to benefit from higher skilled play. Beyond that archer focus, Maya then have a couple of things that may hurt a bit more at this level, between starting at your pop limit, potentially throwing players off the instant they start the game, which never helps with nerves when playing online, but the lack of cavalry can also be a curveball. I've seen players at lower levels then use eagles in the wrong matchup sometimes as well, and not know about the many anti-eagle bonuses there are among infantry units. So this is maybe the story of a slightly counterintuitive civilization, being propped up just enough by a strong economy and archer discount to stay out of the bottom 5. It's definitely a case where you wouldn't argue the civilization is bad, they just throw a lot of curveballs at this particular level of play. Number 5 is then another archer civilization, and I'm sure for many people the most surprising on the list, with the Britons. Again, we see the general pattern of better results with increased skill level, as is standard for archer civs, which again just feels like better micro, players being better at preserving units, and then taking advantage of power spikes to a degree you don't see at 850 and under. What's funny is Britons are the second most popular civilization at low elo though, and yet are performing poorly, at least to whatever extent you can say a 46% win rate is notably poor. Let's keep that context in mind here. In fairness, those two things may be somewhat related, as players below 1000 elo tend to have below 50% win rates, so a popular civ at this level would be expected to have a slightly suppressed win percentage. But I'd also argue it's just not a civ that's very friendly to players at this level. Longbows are cool of course, but the most powerful military bonus here is their extra range, which is best exploited with good micro, and also doesn't help until after Feudal Age, where it's critical for archer civs to preserve and build up their archer numbers. Koreans or Ethiopians actually feel much more beginner friendly as archer civs, and it's not surprising to see that play out in the stats. That said, I would never discourage someone from playing Britons, and they probably are a good way to practice micro. It's just until someone builds that skill, they're a slightly more challenging civ. In a similar vein, next at number 4, we have another popular one, with the Byzantines. I definitely get the appeal of this one, and I think most players go through a phase at one point where they love this civilization, which are sold as a great counter civ that can do everything and is perfect for turtling. In reality, they're another civ that performs better with increasing skill level. In this case, not because they're an archer-focused civ, but simply their strength is their wide tech tree and unit discounts, which interestingly are things that don't seem to predict success at lower levels. The big discount civs in Goths, Mayans, Berbers, Byzantines, etc. all seem to perform average to bottom tier at low elo, which isn't what I would have guessed, as those seem like easy to use passive bonuses. It could be the bottleneck on unit production at this level often isn't resources, and if you're floating a lot of resources all the time, then unit discounts don't really come into play as often. That's just my speculation. A defensive playstyle is also something that just works better in campaigns than the 1v1 ladder, though again, if you love Byzantines, don't let that stop you from playing them. Next up at number 3, we have in some ways the opposite, with an incredibly unpopular civ, which seems particularly disliked at mid to low elo, with the Bengalis. Smaller sample size issues are definitely at play, with a bizarrely outlierish performance compared to higher elo brackets. Part of that is the civ is a bit of a mixed bag, with elephants taking less bonus damage, monks having armor, and then the unique chariot unit flipping between ranged and melee mode. There isn't a clear specialty here, and it's a civilization that relies on less common units like monks and elephants, while then missing knights entirely. A relatively slow civilization in the early game, pushed into non-standard army compositions, and a micro-intensive unique unit just sounds like a bottom-tier low elo civ when you lay it out. Moving on to number 2, we have what I would have expected as number 1, with the Chinese. The disconnect between the Chinese win rate across skill levels has been discussed for years, and it's just the whole archer pattern we've already seen, this time dialed up to 11. Not only do you have the archer focus, making them a bit more micro-dependent, but then add in their unusual start with 3 extra villagers and losing resources, and your main long-term bonus is then tech discounts. At first, those discounts might sound like something equally strong at all levels, but in practice requires capitalizing on unit transitions and timings in a way that just works much better at high levels. There was a notable blip for sub 850 elo players when rocket carts and fire lancers were first added, and maybe players took a few weeks to figure out what those things were and how to deal with them, bumping Chinese into the mid-tier for about a month, but they're now back in the bottom tier at lower skill levels. For top players, of course, they're still number 1, and are just a fascinating case study in how a civilization can be among the best or worst, depending on who's asking. That said, at least as of this patch, they're not the worst for under 850 elo, and instead, that dubious distinction goes to the Gurjaras. Gurjaras, of course, also have a bit of an unusual start, with herdables going into mills to generate food. And while unusual starts are never a good thing at lower levels, this one in particular can be a tough one to navigate if you place an early lumber camp without thinking and then can't afford an early mill, or in the context of a lot of men-at-arms play, making that building and the herdables inside an extra juicy early target. Their main strengths are then unique or less common units, with the Chakram Thrower, Travamsha Rider, Elephant Archers, and then Camels with extra bonus damage. It all departs from the infantry and standard knight or crossbow formula, and I suspect a lot of players just don't know what to do with the civilization, similar to Bengalis. Either way, that does it for our worst performing civilizations at under 850 elo. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.